Thank you, everyone, whatever region you're in, for joining us this morning. Or if you're in another region this afternoon or evening, we really appreciate you coming to listen to our security insights every quarter. As always, we are here to discuss our Internet Security Report, which we'll get into more detail about what that is, but it's basically a quantifiable security intelligence report we release every quarter based on our products. Before we jump in, let me introduce myself. I'm Corey Nachreiner, the CSO, or if you please, CISO of WatchGuard. Don't really care what executive acronym you use, but basically I'm the guy along with my team in charge of securing us, WatchGuard, as a corporation. But both me and my team have also been part of the CTO office, where we've been thought leaders and researchers in security for a long time. While I lose my voice, I'm going to hand it off to Marc for a second to introduce himself.
Yeah, good start. Hey everyone, I'm Marc Laliberte, and I work under Corey, leading our security operations team as well as the threat lab team. I think everyone's probably sick of the joke that I do all the work while Corey does all the meetings, but that is still the case. But despite the fact is, these days, we actually have a very small part in writing and editing the report that we put out every quarter. The bulk of the work goes to our team under us, doing the research, analyzing the data, reverse engineering malware samples that we see to find exactly what might be ending up on an endpoint. They do a great job every quarter of helping build these trends that we're going to talk about in this webinar and in the full report that should publish very early next week. So definitely would not be done without the rest of our co-authors in there.
No, amazing team. And I would say Marc's not even under me, by the way. He is a core partner to taking care of the security here at WatchGuard. And as much as he gives me shit, and I keep on reminding him I do work, he actually is going to be a great CISO one day. But without going into that too much more, let's go ahead and jump into the agenda. We're going to do this webinar like we do all our internet security reports, first by introducing what the heck is this internet security report y'all are talking about. We'll talk about what the report is and how it's made up of primarily the Firebox feed. I'll leave that to Marc for a second. The Firebox feed is just one set of our product pillars, basically our network security. But then we also have endpoint products now with WatchGuard EPDR and the other legacy products. So we'll also dive into some of the trends we learn from our endpoint stuff. But the point of this report, like always, if you read the intro of this report, the one thing that's constant in life and in internet security is it always changes. There is no constant other than change. While sometimes the report seems like it's the same old stuff over and over, behind the scenes, attackers, whether quickly or slowly, are always changing up tactics slightly. So we do this report mostly to figure out those changes so that we can help you secure yourself. We don't just want to talk about the bad guys, what the bad guys are doing because we like them or think it's cool. We want to know if they've changed their tactics and if those tactics changes require any new defenses for you. So just remember, the theme of this is more about thinking about how you can defend against that. But with that said, I mentioned the Firebox feed, which is the marketing name for our network threat intelligence. Why don't I hand it off to Marc to talk a bit about that?
Yeah, so for those that are new to this webinar or our internet security reports, the Firebox feed, it's our collection of threat intelligence that our customers and our partners have opted in to sharing with us. It's anonymized data where you can go into a Firebox configuration under the general settings, click the little checkbox that says send device feedback to WatchGuard. That sends some telemetry on the services that are in use on the device to help product management focus their attention on the firewalls. But it also sends us information anytime one of the security services on the Firebox detects and blocks a threat. And so when we have tens of thousands of these devices enrolled in that telemetry feed for us around the world, it lets us get a view of worldwide threats that are targeting our customer networks. The feed's built up of a few different security services on the Firebox, starting with the 3 layers of anti-malware that we have. Gateway antivirus, which is the legacy, as we call it, signature-based anti-malware service, does a really great job of quickly catching known threats. But as you'll see, not all threats are known, and some can evade signature-based detections. That's where our other 2 layers of anti-malware comes in, Intelligent AV, which is the We call it machine learning. I feel like marketing would slap us if they saw that. We're supposed to call it artificial intelligence these days, I feel like. But really, machine learning based detection where it can quickly still predict whether a file is going to be bad or good based off of its corpus of training data that we've built up over time. And then behind that is APT blocker, which is the behavioral based anti malware engine, where it will actually take that file that may have made it past those first two engines, send it into a safe, secure cloud sandbox, and detonate it to watch its behaviors. And if it raises enough red flags for suspicious or known malicious activity, it'll have the firebox block that download or block that file from going through it. Beyond malware detections, we also have the intrusion protection service or IPS engine, which is looking for network-based exploits. And this could be an attack against a exposed network web server, like a web server you have, or some application that has listening ports out there, or it can even protect against client-side exploits. Like if one of your users has an out-of-date version of Internet Explorer and happens across a watering hole attack that will try and fingerprint and exploit that browser, IPS can detect that attack even coming down to the client and block it there as well too. And then behind all of that is our DNS Watch DNS firewalling service, where we look at the domain level for connections and compare it against our list of threat intelligence sources for malicious domains. It can block connections regardless of what protocol the actual connection is going to use. A lot of our detections tend to be web browsing activities, so people going to phishing websites or potentially downloading a malware payload from a compromised website. But the service can also block malware command and control too, where if you've got an infection on your computer beaconing home, it'll often try and resolve a domain name to an IP address, and we can detect it, block it there, and redirect it to a safe, secure black hole as well. So all of these together combined are our Firebox feed. And that's where we start off our report every year, going through the high level trends and some of the specific threats that we see in the given quarter. And so with that, let's go ahead and dive
Yeah,
in.
before I dive in, I did like you've totally covered the network side of our quantifiable stuff, but I did want to bring up we're that this is kind of giving you vision before it's happening, but we hope to bring even more of WatchGuard's products into our report. One cool service we have now is it's the various versions of ThreatSync Plus SAS and ThreatSync Plus, NDR. NDR stands for Network Detection and Response, but as you saw for antivirus, we have plain signature antivirus, but then we have more advanced machine learning and behavioral analysis antivirus. IPS, on the other hand, is still very signature based. But with our new ThreatSync Plus services with NDR, we have now more anomaly based detection network security. So completely, it was based on an acquisition, a very cool new product that me and Mark are actually excited to use ourselves. But in the future, maybe we can get some more intelligence from that. And I guarantee you, as far as blocking network threats, it's definitely a useful service. So more to come in our report in the future. But as you mentioned, with that said, why don't you share the malware highlights, Mark?
Yeah, so starting at the 10,000 foot level, looking at just the high level trends for the quarter, this quarter was actually pretty interesting, where we had a drop in network based malware detections. It was down around 15% from the previous quarter, still at around 799 detections per firebox out there, so like around 800. There's quite a few malware threats to be blocking on each individual device. But the biggest interesting change was the mix of the types of malware that we saw. Like historically, we see a lot of evasive threats, ones that can get past signature-based detections, and fewer known threats, the ones that are caught by signature-based protections. But this quarter kind of flipped the script, where we actually saw a substantial drop in threats, both caught by the intelligent AV service and by the APT blocker service, a 42% drop in IAV and a 64% drop in APT, respectively, paired with a increase in threats caught by gateway antivirus, around 40% increase. So the bulk of the threats we saw were actually caught by the traditional signature-based protections. Now, the way that our detection engines are kind of stacked in the device, by nature, if something is caught by gateway antivirus, it does not go to the other two engines. And so if it is doing a better job that quarter, catching more threats, that would just mean fewer threats making it to the other engines. So this could just be explained by we had strong signature sets and good updates to our heuristic detections within Gateway Antivirus. Maybe that caught a larger amount of threats, or maybe attackers got lazy and just relied mostly on known threats and less evasive technologies. So it's tough to tell just from this 10,000 foot level, but it was a very interesting and dramatic shift in the types of threats that we saw, especially compared to like the last couple of years worth of data that we have. And
For
Gordon, you
sure,
want
and I
to
think
maybe
we'll
expand
see
on
how.
that?
Not really. I'll move to the next slide. I was just going to say we'll see just how dramatic in the next thing.
Yeah.
Well, I guess it is me that will cover this, which is zero-day malware. As you mentioned in the mix, especially based on the order, zero-day malware. Now, I know it just shows zero-day here, but we always add malware when we're using this stat. I repeat it every time. When we say zero-day malware, we do not mean the classic industry term of zero-day, which has more to do with a vulnerability in software that has been released in the wild but has no patch yet. If a bad guy finds a vulnerability in software before good guys and there's no fix, that is a zero-day because you then count how many days until a patch is available. But in this case, zero-day malware, what we're trying to talk about is malware that takes more advanced detection. A signature, meaning a good guy's already figured out something was malware and written a pattern to catch it, those aren't good enough in many cases because these bad guys have many different techniques. Me and Mark have shared in previous presentations, like packing and encrypting is a very simple one, to make old malware look good again. And this statistic is supposed to represent how much malware is zero day. In the past, this has been as high as 70%. And even when it's average or low to us, it's rarely below half malware. But as you can see, this quarter, only 20% of clear text delivered malware was zero day. 80% of malware was caught by the Gateway Antivirus Service before it even got to those additional services. So that is quite a big change. The other stat you see here is with TLS. You've probably heard of SSL TLS. It's the encryption protocol that protects a lot of different internet traffic, but primarily HTTPS, encrypted web traffic. We also know that most of the traffic on the internet right now is encrypted, and the real nastiness tends to happen a little more in encrypted traffic. And in the past, again, usually the encrypted traffic has more zero-day malware than unencrypted, which is still true, but in this case only by 2%, and it's still a very low number. So as Mark said, it's very hard to figure out the kind of root cause for this drop. It could very likely be our gateway antivirus had new heuristics that are just good at catching something new that's maybe a common packer. Packers and encryptors, we don't have time to go into detail, but a lot of the time they have stubs that are used to kind of obfuscate the executable. And if a well-known packer uses the same stub and maybe signature writers find this new one, they can add like a signature to catch a packer encryptor, and that will catch a lot of obfuscated malware that's packed encrypt with that particular one. So who knows for sure what it is? But long story short, zero day has been at its lowest ever. I guess this means technically you can, gateway antivirus is good enough in Q3, but I guess only good enough if you're still okay with missing 1/5 of malware. So it might still be good to make sure to use APT blocker and intelligent AV. But with that, why don't you dive into some detail on the malware, Mark?
Yeah, so in the report, we go into a few different views of specific malware threats. The first one is our top detections by volume. These are the top 10 malware families that we saw just by the number of detections. Could be a large amount impacting a single organization, or they could be widely spread out still, but we get into that view a little later too. There were three new ones this quarter. The first one was really interesting, the one that popped up to number one out of nowhere, basically. It's a family called Medusa, but it's really a Mirai botnet variant. So if you remember, the Mirai botnet originally launched in August of 2016, I think. So we're coming up on its 10-year birthday here just next year. It was a IoT botnet malware that had worm-like capabilities to automatically find other exposed and vulnerable IoT devices, log into them with a set of 60-something default credentials, install itself, and then turn that bot into another spreader. So it was highly effective back in 2016. It was used in a few different denial of service attacks that were record breaking at the time in terms of throughput, even though the connections were coming from these small little IoT devices. But attackers have since then taken that source code, which was released by the original author, published publicly for anyone to use, and built on top of it with even more capabilities. The first version of Mirai, it literally just had a set of 60 something credentials. It would try and log in. If it succeeded, it would try and load up the malware and then continue on. The new versions can add things like automatically exploiting vulnerabilities, where if it's a IoT device or, oh, good job, Apple, and freezing again, IoT device, or even just a network connected Linux system that has a known vulnerability, can automatically try and exploit that, compromise the device, infect it, and then continue spreading. It even has more sophisticated brute forcing, where now instead of just 68 credentials in there, can go through entire word lists and try to brute force credentials of users. So they've added these capabilities to like the skeleton of Mirai over time. And we saw a large attack of this specific malware going around exclusively in Europe, Middle East, and Africa, so the EMEA region for us, in Q3 of last year. So really interesting seeing that relatively old threat at this point still moving around targeting exposed devices. Main takeaway from that is if you've got a IoT device or even just a Linux system, make sure it's not exposed to the internet, and especially not without some sort of like perimeter-based protections like a firewall in front of it or a UTM device. Beyond that one, there were two other quote unquote new detections in there that we say it's new, but the reality is we had seen them previously in our top encrypted malware lists in previous quarters. Both of them are phishing related. So there was a JavaScript based downloader that usually arrives over email. It's disguised to look like an invoice to trick users into clicking it. But if you click it, it executes the script using the built-in Windows native scripting engine, ultimately launches a PowerShell command inside there to go download additional stages and end up infecting the system. The second one was actually a little more interesting. It's mail.stacked. Whatever identifier for it. This one was primarily Microsoft OneNote attachments to phishing emails. So OneNote, it lacks a lot of the protections that Microsoft added to Office documents in recent years. In early 2023, Microsoft put out an update that disabled macros by default in untrusted Office documents, so ones downloaded either from the internet or email attachments. And it made it really difficult, like almost impossible for the end user to circumvent that protection. There's no more like little yellow thing, do you want to enable macros? It's just totally disabled. That actually had a really big impact on macro-based malware. We saw a dramatic decrease in it very quickly after Microsoft put out that update and users started getting updated Microsoft Office applications. So attackers have instead pivoted towards other mechanisms for tricking users into executing and downloading malware. And OneNote files have grown in popularity. So if you get one of these malicious files and you're curious, you open it up and you have OneNote installed on your computer, it'll pop up a little notebook. We've seen a few different variants of this. The most common one, it's a note file with a image in it, like literally just a JPEG. It's blurred. It makes it look like there's a protected like document behind it. It's got a little window saying this document is protected. Click here in order to open the document. If you click that click here button though, it executes a embedded VB script, which kicks off a chain for a fileless malware attack. There's other variants where they actually have an embedded executable directly in the OneNote file as well too. If you click that view button, it'll launch the executable. But most commonly it uses JavaScript or VB script, sometimes PowerShell and sometimes HTML, in order to kick off fileless attacks using this Office document. So main takeaway from that is attackers are getting clever at leveraging new and other alternative mechanisms to still trick victims into executing threats that they may not think are actually that scary from the onset. Like a OneNote file, what's the worst that a notepad could do to me? But the reality is quite a lot.
By the way, I would note to self we should probably throw in the top encrypted malware too, which is another thing you audience members can find in the actual report itself. But before Mark dives into widespread, do you know that what was it called, Mail Stacker? Excuse me, Mark. In the top encrypted malware, there was also another signature for Morpheus. I think it was like the third in the top 5 encrypted malware. That was also that kind of one note vulnerability issue and tied to mail stackers. So just know, besides what Mark talked about in the top 10 malware, it was in the encrypted malware as well.
Yep. So this next view is our most widespread malware. So these are detections that impacted the most individual networks out there. So they may be lower in total volume, but at least impacting more organizations. And there were 3 new ones this quarter, all linked together. So one of them was the HTML.phishing one. The other 2 were the 2 Trojan.zmutsy ones. These were all downloaders that ultimately downloaded the Remcos remote access Trojan. So one of the examples we have that we go into in depth in the report, showing the entire attack chain, starts with a Excel file that pretends to be just a quote for something, usually unsolicited, but disguised in a way to make someone curious and want to open it. If you open that Excel file, it exploits a Office vulnerability, CVE 2017-0199, really popular one from 2017, where if you still haven't updated your Office or Office applications in the last 8 years, just opening the file itself is often enough to kick this off. It does prompt the user to enable editing. Click that button, which allows active content to run in the document. It then exploits the vulnerability and launches a PowerShell command. That PowerShell command downloads a JPEG image, or at least a file with a .jpg extension, but then extracts a base64 encoded bit of data from that image file, decodes it into what's actually a DLL, a library for Windows, then loads up that library, and then executes a function out of it, which downloads and deobfuscates the Remcos remote access Trojan and runs it. So all of this kicked off from just a malicious Excel file that made its way onto your endpoint. Now, hopefully, all of you are using patch management solutions to keep your users' Microsoft Office applications updated, but the attackers continue using these types of vulnerabilities because a lot of folks don't. Maybe they only bought a license for Office back in 2017, installed it, and never updated it since then, and that can leave them open to this type of attack. Corey, you want to add?
I'm sure we'll get into it, but the other thing you pointed out while you were talking, but just to make clear, patching is the best for sure, but it's still worth getting your users involved because they would have to enable active content. In the same way we've trained users not to touch macros in Office documents unless they know for sure they're local macros that have been written by your team. They should not enable active content in any external unsolicited document. That could save them even without a patch. Yep. So yeah, good stuff. I'll take over to transition a bit for our network attacks. Again, just a reminder, this is based on IPS. And before we dive into this stat, I mean, the overall theme of IPS is it was kind of a modest, dare I say, boring quarter. IPS detections were up, but they were only up by a meager 1.8%. So that it is up about 41% year over year, but quarter over quarter, just barely a 2-point change. One thing we do track, but it's not super important, is unique signatures. What we mean by that is, as we're watching these top attacks, are they very diverse? Are they using lots of different software vulnerabilities? Or is it more the same amount of very common ones over and over? There were 435 unique signatures for Q3, which is about 2.4% less than last quarter. So down a little bit by unique signatures for sure. As you can see right here, though, the average firebox handled about 126 detections during the quarter per firebox, which is about a 7.66 increase year over year, and just a very meager increase for the quarter. Next up, oops, wrong place. Let me go ahead and move it to the top attacks. So these were the top attacks we saw in Q2. To be honest, there's not a whole lot to see here. These signatures, these top attacks didn't really change in the top 10. They changed a bit in order in volume. For instance, the top attack, which is a buffer overflow against Nginx. Nginx is a very popular web proxy and or browser or server. Uh, that was an old 2019 denial of service buffer overflow. I believe it can only be used, it was a low severity vulnerability that could be used to knock down an Nginx server, but there hasn't been any known exploit code to actually execute code via that particular buffer overflow. So that was our top hit last quarter as well. In fact, last quarter, it made up 30% of all the IPS detections. So people were really hammering that old flaw. It's still number one, but you can see its percentage is just around 17%. So it's dropped quite a bit. Other than that, we see a lot of the very common web-based, web application vulnerabilities. A lot of generic things like directory traversal, SQL injection, cross-site scripting, which is very normal. A lot of those signatures are written generically to catch, instead of a specific cross-site scripting vulnerability. In some cases, they might catch specific ones, but they're generic enough that they can catch a lot of attempts that use the same type of technique. The only other real thing of note in the top 10 would be the fact that proxy logon, which is, you can see the fifth spot, Web Microsoft Exchange Server Remote Code Execution vulnerability. That old CVE 2021 vulnerability, that was a big deal, a very easy to abuse and dangerous 9.8 CVE or CVSS vulnerability, is still being exploited. It's at the point where I think 99.9% of people probably have it patched. So this is probably some sort of automated mass scan capability, keeping trying this vulnerability just because why not? It's easy to try. But it is still on our list, despite the fact that you should have patched that at least 4 years ago. One of the things we added to our report, but I don't actually have a slide for, is new signatures in the top 50. One of the things we've done, because our top 10 list for IPS has looked very consistent over and over. I mentioned that one of the things that is constant on is change, and attackers do change things, but they also don't change automated things that work. Because of things like mass scans and exploit scanning software out there, it's easy to keep on spamming these same flaws, hoping to find new victims. So in order for us to find some interesting vulnerabilities to talk about, we have to dive a little deeper in our top 50 list. And in our report, you can read about 3 additional vulnerabilities. One was in Telerik UI, which is a kind of a server-side web application framework used by some folks. This was an older vulnerability. I won't go into a ton of detail, but it was critically rated. And this was ranked 37 in our top 50, and it showed up for the first time in that list. Another interesting vulnerability was in the GLPI. I'm going to murder the French. It's like Gestionnaire Libre de PAC information, which you should do it with your last name. You're probably much better. In English, though, it's a free IT equipment manager. So it's kind of an open source IT management software suite, which is something very useful to IT folks and frankly to security teams that want to keep track of assets. So a decent vulnerability that you might find in businesses that use this open source agent. It had a SQL injection vulnerability that could allow people to lead to arbitrary code execution if they wanted to. And there was one other one, Ghost, that we talk about, but I highly recommend you check out our report to learn more about those. With that, let's go ahead to pivot to our DNS watch or our DNS firewall. Go for it, Mark.
Yeah, and so with DNS Watch, we block a number of different categories of threats, way more than you see just here. But there's 3 specific ones that we tend to talk about in the report. First are domains associated with malware, either the command and control connection for it or the delivery vehicle for malware. Second one is compromised websites, which are legitimate websites that may still be serving their legitimate benign purpose, but have at some point been compromised to host malicious content somewhere on the page within its directories. And then phishing ones are a bit self-explanatory. They're domains associated with phishing campaigns. With the malware domains, there was one really interesting one at the very top for this last quarter called polyfill.io. And if you were paying attention to the security news last year, this may be familiar to you, but this was a previously legitimate domain for a popular open source library called polyfill.js. So polyfill.js was a library that lets JavaScript developers backport new JavaScript features into older browsers, so that if someone connects to your website using Internet Explorer 10 or whatever, and they don't have the new latest and greatest stuff in the JavaScript engine, this library would help let those features work on the website in these older browsers, so that you wouldn't have to make like custom versions of your website to handle every single type of browser out there. You could support whatever the latest and greatest is. This library takes care of making it work on everything. So developers could add this library by linking to cdn.polyfill.io, so their content delivery network, directly in the page. And anytime a visitor loads up the page, it would automatically go grab the copy of the library from cdn.polyfill.io. Well, back in February of 2024, a Chinese company called FunNull bought the polyfill.io domain and the GitHub account associated with the main repository for this widely used library out there. And just a couple of months later, they inserted malicious code into that library and began hosting it on the legitimate, or I guess the no longer legitimate, content delivery network for this. This was quickly spotted by security researchers and the likes of like Cloudflare out there, and we quickly added it to our malware domain threat feed to protect our customers from getting that malicious code. It could have potentially impacted hundreds of thousands of websites out there that were linking to cdn.polyfill.io. And after adding it to our feed in that year, I got to turn off the stupid little Mac OS emoticon things because it just freezes everything every time. Yeah, Corey's is working just fine. Anyways, so after adding it, it quickly shot up to the top 10, or the top of our malware block list. In fact, it had 30 times more block connections than the rest of the top 10 combined. And that's protecting users that would have otherwise downloaded this Trojanized version of this application. Others out in the space took some pretty arguably dramatic steps as well too. Cloudflare, for example, they set up their own safe alternative to the main CDN and even forcefully redirected connections that would have gone to the tainted one to the legitimate one. So you could argue ethics and responsibilities around there too, but they were also protecting their users. But either way, this could have been, and actually was, an attempted massive supply chain attack against people out there that we were able to quickly identify and block and protect a large number of customers. The other two new ones that were in the top malware domains, one of them was associated with the Big Ponzi IoT malware campaign that was impacting smart TVs. We talked about that in the Q1 2024 security report, went into that in quite a bit detail. But really interesting campaign that went after a bunch of Android-based TVs that were exposed to the internet. The second one was a command and control channel for a banking Trojan that was primarily targeting Latin America victims. Looking at the compromised websites, there was two new ones, and one of them was pretty interesting. It's the tropicalforestproducts.com, which, by the way, should go without saying, don't go to any of these domains because they are by nature malicious. And hopefully your defensive controls will protect you, but we still want to show them just to give you the actual data we're seeing. But anyways, that one was a compromised WordPress website that was compromised to host the SOC-Golish malware downloader. So SOC-Golish works by when a victim is tricked into visiting a page that's infected with it, it'll fingerprint their browser, figure out what operating system they're on, what type of browser they're using, Firefox, Chrome, Safari, whatever. And then it'll show a fake little window saying your browser is out of date and you need to download this update in order to view this page. Now, to us, IT and security professionals, we recognize that as bogus. To the random untrained end user out there, they might not notice that as a fake browser update. If you click the button, it'll download not an update for Firefox, but a malware payload that was hosted by SOC-Golish. So this one was on a WordPress website. Compromised WordPress websites often make the top list here because WordPress gives a lot of power to the extensions and plugins that it supports. And if one of those has a vulnerability, it can allow an attacker to quickly take over and compromise the entire web server. There weren't any new updates to the top phishing domains, but the main trends in here were continued threats being hosted on SharePoint subdomains. So abusing the ability to register whatever subdomain you want on SharePoint.com to host effectively whatever you want, even a Microsoft 365 fish now on a valid Microsoft owned domain. And that can trick victims that just hover over a link and assume that if it's a Microsoft domain, it's got to be legitimate, without knowing that attackers can abuse these cloud hosting services to host whatever they want, including phishing messages, target or phishing
I wish we
campaigns.
had stats to know how long those sites stay. Like, it blows my mind that Microsoft wouldn't have more automated means to, as soon as one of these, vanity URL domains of theirs is used for something bad, they kill it. I assume they do. They could still show up in our top 10 list if there is some other malicious link that forces people to keep going to it when it's dead.
Mhm.
But I'm kind of curious how long it takes Microsoft to detect and get rid of these, because it's happening so regularly, it seems.
I would hope pretty quickly, but like you said, it could just be links and emails that people are still clicking. Even if the destination is down, it would still be blocked and
Yep.
detected by this. So with that though, let's go into the final defensive tips just for the Firebox feed section. And for the first tip, we titled it "Treat Your Web Browser Extensions Like Applications." And when you think about like one of the main issues that we have in our industry, I feel like, and I don't want to speak for you, Corey, but I'm going to anyway, is I feel like we
It's a
don't
common
take
theme you've done repeatedly in just about every meeting.
I feel like we don't take browser extensions seriously in our industry, and that they're incredibly powerful in what they're capable of doing, especially because web browsers these days, the modern web browser, like the Chromium engine, is extremely powerful on its own too. And while we may do a great job of patching traditional desktop applications to keep them safe from known vulnerabilities, web browser extensions are often overlooked and sometimes just completely forgotten or ignored. And this can open up users to risk, especially because managing web browser extensions is still kind of feels like the wild, wild west in some cases, where yes, there's official Chromium stores for installing them, but it's relatively trivial to sideload extensions into your web browser too, which means attackers can potentially trick victims into loading very powerful extensions that have a lot of capabilities on their endpoint. And even for the legitimate extensions too, if you're not keeping them updated, if an attacker finds a vulnerability in them, that could allow them to now take over your web browser and effectively control or at least view anything you do within that browser, depending on the level of access that extension was given. So the main takeaway though is apply the same best practices that you're already using in your traditional applications on your endpoint to web browser extensions too. That means only downloading them from safe, trusted sources, applying good patch management practices to them, and maybe using some of the enterprise controls within your web browsers in order to restrict where these extensions can be downloaded from. Corey,
I
you
was
want
going
to
to
take the next one?
dive into those enterprise controls. I think from a business perspective, that would be a very important thing. Maybe don't allow anything but whitelisted web browser extensions if that's a possibility at your enterprise. But with that said, moving on to the second tip, as Mark mentioned when he is talking about some of the top malware, both on the top 10 list and as I mentioned on our top encrypted list, OneNote files could contain the next 0-day. We have to continually remind our users that these office or document or productivity files that may not seem like they're executable can still be booby trapped using many scripting techniques. OneNote files in particular is one that I don't think many people think about. I think, as I say all the time, even grandmas and grandpas know that executables are bad. And I think in the past 5 years, because of people like us repeating it, everyone's starting to get that Word and Excel files are bad. But OneNote is one of those unusual ones that people might just assume might be clean, because why is a Notepad file, how could it be bad? But as Mark pointed out, it completely is. From administrative level, you need to make sure you're always patching Microsoft Office as soon as they release any sort of patches, which is the second Tuesday of every month. From a user level, make sure to train your users that if they're going to open Office, first of all, they should consider whether or not they should open Office documents. I absolutely get that Office document is a very normal file to get in a business context. But if it's from someone you know at work, is there context? Were you expecting this file? Is there something unusual about this person sending it to you? Think about that before you actually open it at all. And maybe if it seems unusual, even from a coworker, ask them via some other means, like maybe a Teams message, or I guess in a reply email, as long as you make sure the address is really them, to see if it's really one they intended to send you. If it's someone you don't know, use even more skepticism on whether or not you really need to open that file. And most importantly, if you do open that file, if it pops up with anything about enabling macros or enabling active content, that's a huge red flag. Yes, in some cases, your coworkers and other people might have legitimate macros, but you really don't want to trust those until you find out for sure. The final thing is, and I think you might be able to do this with OneNote files. You probably can't do this with Word, Excel, or PowerPoint documents because you need those to flow in a business. But I personally, maybe I'm wrong, but I haven't seen many people sharing their notepads. A OneNote file is a .one extension type. And if you use a local email server in our Firebox SMTP proxy, you can block extension types from even being delivered in email. So maybe consider blocking .one extensions. If you use a cloud email service, you might have to use things like our cloud email protection suite or some other software, but a lot of cloud-based email protection suites out there will also allow you to block extensions. So I get for PowerPoint, Word, or Excel, you probably cannot do that because you need your users to send those files to each other. But with OneNote, maybe it's something you can consider.
Yep.
And I'll throw it to you for the last one, Mark.
And for the final tip, it's continuing the trend that we talked about in the first one of just don't leave any updates behind. Like we put a lot of focus in our industry on Microsoft Patch Tuesday, and rightfully so. Like operating system vulnerabilities are a pretty big boogeyman that you need to address quickly. But auxiliary applications like your business productivity apps, your office applications, your just bespoke software that you might have installed within the company, all of those are still potential avenues to compromise and gain control of a system too. And many desktop applications, they've got elevated permissions, which means that if they get compromised, the attacker can quickly or immediately get local admin on your computer too. And it's trivial from there to escalate to domain credentials and continue impacting the wider network. And so while you hopefully already have a process for installing Microsoft's updates very quickly after Patch Tuesday, the second Tuesday of every month, make sure that your patch management tools have a large collection of other supported applications too, to keep all of the other auxiliary files updated on a regular basis within your organization. Corey, you want to move on to the
Yeah,
next
let's
section?
do it. Yeah, now we're going to transition to another product pillar, which is our endpoint products. Just a reminder, these quantifiable trends are primarily coming from WatchGuard EPDR or the kind of legacy version of that called Adaptive Defense 360, which is essentially the same product, but before WatchGuard took over with the naming. The first trend we'll cover right away is despite malware being quite a bit down on the network side of things, one thing you might realize if maybe more malware is getting past the network or not being seen at the network, it might be going after the endpoints directly or being detected on the endpoints. And this was a huge quarter for endpoint malware detections. You can see early in this year, we had a spike in Q1. Basically, Q1, we saw double the malware of the previous quarter in Q4, but it dropped back down in Q2 to what we saw in Q4. But this time, we got a quadruple jump in malware. So the amount of malware being detected by our endpoint services is very, very high this year. So, a good reminder that while we think both network and endpoint malware detection is important because there are ways to evade malware detection or endpoint detections, but there's also different ways to evade network detections. So a combination of both will really catch the most threats. Despite that, malware is really up on the endpoint. So why don't we go into the types of, in the same way we have different services that block malware in different ways, our endpoint has lots of different engines. So I'll let you cover that, Mark.
Exactly. EPDR, it's not just a AV engine with some EDR tacked onto it. It is multiple layers of ways to catch malware or just endpoint-based threats. And kind of like the perimeter this quarter, where we saw a dramatic increase and a large portion, the largest portion of our threats caught by traditional signature-based protections, the roughly 80% of the threats we saw on the endpoint were blocked using the on-system engine in EPDR and 8360. So this includes signatures, heuristics, some behavioral analysis, our contextual detection engine that looks at not just what's running, but how it's running. An example of that might be you don't want to block PowerShell. I mean, you maybe want to block PowerShell on your endpoint, but generally you might need to allow some legitimate applications to run, but you want to understand how they're running. And if it starts doing suspicious activity, then you want to block that application. That's where the contextual engine comes in. And so all of this combined accounted for roughly 80% of the detections that we blocked on the endpoints. The next biggest one was our machine learning slash AI based behavioral detection and anomaly detection capabilities of blocking unknown threats. Those two combined were the overwhelming majority of threats that we caught on the endpoint. The interesting thing is both of those are generally entirely on the endpoint itself, meaning no connectivity back to the cloud to catch those. In previous quarters, we've seen a large portion of threats rely on our cloud-based services too, additional, more powerful AI engines that run in there, some more powerful behavioral detections, or even our manual attestation analysis to catch some of the threats. But this quarter, it was primarily detected and blocked by the endpoint itself.
If I pause there, Mark, this is purely speculation, audience, but we talked about how we weren't quite sure why gateway antivirus blew up in network. But one of the reasons could just be malware authors got lazy and decided to just spam old threats rather than make new ones. The one thing I will say, if we were picking between that versus gateway antivirus maybe getting better, it is interesting to see endpoint, despite malware shooting up, is really seeing the same threat, the same trend. It's being caught by the frontline, more signature or heuristic level uh, antivirus services, even on the endpoint. And the cloud stuff, where we start to use machine learning and sandboxing and stuff like that, is not catching as much. So
Yeah.
we still can't say for sure why it's happened, but it is actually very interesting to me to see it happening on network and endpoint this quarter.
Yeah. Now we go through a lot of different trends and data within the endpoint section, like a huge number. Our author for that section goes borderline overboard on the amount of analysis he does
A
on
lot of
everything from
interesting ransomware group stuff, for instance, is one
ransomware
of the
to
things.
crypto
Yeah.
miners to different attack vectors. But one of the other main ones I like to highlight is how do malware infections originate on an endpoint? What is the top vector for malware delivery? And this quarter, roughly 43% of the threats we saw originated with a script, and specifically a non-Python script that became big enough on its own that we pulled it out. So an additional 3% came from Python scripts. The rest were overwhelmingly PowerShell-based threats,
PowerShell.
but
Yeah.
a bit of a mix of like JavaScript and other scripting engines as well too. But still using the scripting engines built into your computer to kick off that threat. Another 30% were the category called Windows, which is, think of it like lol bins. So the living off the land binaries built into Microsoft Windows that attackers can leverage to start an attack. Things like certutil or psexec or wmi exec.
Yeah.
These are very popular avenues to start a living off the land attack. But combined, it was roughly what 76% of threats were using living off the land techniques on the endpoint. So three quarters were caught because of our capabilities to detect those living off the land techniques. These types of threats would typically evade traditional antivirus services or traditional antivirus engines. You really need something looking at the context of what's going on, the behaviors of what's going on in order to catch these types of threats. The rest of them were a mix of malicious Office documents, browsers. We actually explode that browser view to look at specifically which browsers were most impacted in the quarter, if you go take a look at the report. But for time's sake, this is what we would cover in the webinar.
Yeah, so why don't we get to final protection tips? Before we do, I have been monitoring chat and questions. Just a reminder before we get near the end, if you have any, feel free to pop them in there and we'll be happy to discuss them at the end. But let's talk about overall report learnings, or more importantly, defenses. And we'll start with the kind of human centric defense, which is turn your weakest link into your strongest ally. The weakest link is the user. Like, we don't mean that to be disparaging to the user. They're probably very smart people, but the people that manage your IT and security, you are experts. You're expected to know all of this stuff we're talking about. If you're listening to this now, I bet you a lot of it is not a surprise to you because you pay attention to this stuff, and you can use administrative controls and security controls to help protect folks. But your users, well, they're not at all dumb people. They're very smart people in whatever, area of the organization they work. They're not expected to necessarily be IT or security experts. It's not because they're dumb or don't care. It's just because it's not their job. And because they don't know this as intimately as you, they end up being the weakest link. You can use all the controls you want, have all your patches applied, but users still can make mistakes from social engineering that turn into a breach. So to turn them into your strongest ally, you really need to build a culture of security awareness and caring about security. And that's not simple. I think every organization now, largely because of compliance, probably has mandatory security awareness training once a year. That's an okay start, but a lot of us automate that with tools that do pretty expected and boring short videos, right? We've all probably seen the phishing videos. And if they're too boring and too obvious, people start to turn them out. They'll certainly have them playing in the background to get the check mark because you're forcing it on them, but they may not be quite as interested. And you do need to do that level of training. But one of the things me and Mark do at WatchGuard that we think is helps is make it more interesting by adding some custom stuff. One of the things you can easily do in a lot of these training platforms are add your own videos. Perhaps have your IT experts or security experts or your executive pop in and talk about maybe a system that you use and is important to your company, and take things like the phishing or spear phishing or online security habits tips and make them more specific to your organization. And you can make this fun and interesting in ways that users really respond. Me and Mark do very regular security trainings and educational content for our company. And I remember one of the company's favorite ones when Mark was talking about all the different ways you can be phished using different social engineering techniques. Because we have a podcast together, he has endless amounts of my audio, probably more than he ever wants to listen to. And he used something called deepfake technology, an AI that can take audio clips of someone's voice and make them speak as though they were that person. And Mark did a cute little thing where he basically said I resigned and gave my job to him, and I give him all my Lego sets to you because I'm a Lego nerd. And that was a very illustrative example of how deepfakes really can help social engineer folks. And you've probably heard other webinars where they've used deepfake video in live chats to social engineer accountants to make money transfers. So try to do security awareness, but realize you need to make it interesting to them. You need to make it specific to your company to help them understand it. And I would also say, don't just stick with the business. Make your users realize that this training is going to help them at home too. All of us nowadays online bank and we're connected in so many ways. So it's not just valuable for them to know this for your business, it's valuable to them. So if you make it good, they will become your strongest ally.
Yep. For the next tip, it's all about putting your foot down on risky email attachments. And Corey already touched on this earlier, where like how'd you put it? Even grandmas and grandpas know that malware.exe attached to an email is probably not something you want to download and execute. And that's assuming that that still somehow made its way into your inbox anyway, too. I would hope that most email services these days
Block
just
EXEs.
straight up block EXEs. And Microsoft has done a lot of great work on even making Office documents less risky by blocking macros by default and all external Office documents received. But this is causing attackers now to transition to newer file types and even older file types. So OneNote files are one that we talked about already a couple of times, that .one file attachment. Like, how often do you actually need to email a .one file to someone else? And if I'm assuming the answer is probably close to never, maybe that's one that you just block. Like, most of you listening probably have an Office 365 subscription or something similar. And instead of sharing the file itself, you can often sync these with your cloud account and then share a link directly to the cloud version of the OneNote file itself too, which is significantly more secure than allowing this type of file download. Another popular one attackers are leveraging are .lnk files, which are legitimately used for desktop shortcuts, but there is no justifiable reason to ever email a .lnk file. So you can completely close off an attack vector by just blocking .lnk files at your email service or your email security gateway. So you can also apply the same guidance to web traffic and web proxies too. If you've got a firebox using the HTTPS proxy to block certain file download types as well, like .one files or .lnk files. Basically setting yourself up by reducing your attack surface, blocking these risky file types with really, I'd imagine, a minimal impact and minimal friction from your end users can help just entirely eliminate current classes of attacks that the threat actors are using. Corey, you want to grab the last one?
Absolutely. So the last one is know your baselines and spot anomalies. And I'll start talking about this kind of manually, but back before we had tools that could really automate this in the industry, one of the things I used to talk about is using any sort of reporting tools that visualize network traffic. And a tip I used to give people is if you had a thing that was visualizing network traffic, maybe by port, what servers it was talking to, things like that, it's still a deluge of information. When you look at that visualization, if you don't intimately know everything happening in your network from every user's, you're just going to see a lot of stuff. But what I recommended the IT people do is spend a couple minutes every morning looking at it. You don't necessarily have to spot anything right away, but look at it and figure out your trends. Is web traffic the most common thing? When there is a lot of web traffic, are there particular servers, like, of course, the e-commerce server that might be hit? As a network administrator, a human, as you just watch this visualization every day, you'll start to naturally get an idea of what's normal, the baseline for your network. And then how do you use those graphical tools to secure yourself? Look for the anomalies. If suddenly there's a huge amount of data being sent somewhere that's unusual, go check it out. That's an investigation for your CISO, your computer security incident response team. This isn't normal. Was this just a one-time thing that was legitimate, or is this different? So figuring out a baseline and then looking for anomalies is the best way, from a network level anyways, you can really start to threat hunt on your organization. But I've been talking in the context of you doing that, and no one has time for that really in this day and age. And this is where tools like ThreatSync plus NDR or just network detection and response tools really help. Machine learning or artificial intelligence, what it's absolutely great at is statistics at scale. Our tool, ThreatSync plus NDR, is specifically made to watch your network traffic over a period of time. How does it gather your network traffic? Well, it can gather it from your fireboxes. It can gather it from all your switches using NetFlow or SFlow. It can gather it from M365 to grab your online cloud email and network traffic via that API. It can use syslog from any network device, including competitive firewalls. And what it does is if you feed it all of that information, our many, many, many different machine learning algorithms will pay attention to what's normal for your network, which will be absolutely different for another industry network. And it will monitor that and then over time start to spot anomalies and differences. So one of the best ways to find unusual activity on your network, not only will it catch new security issues that may not have signatures because they're big anomalies, but you may even learn more about your business. It might even catch actual users doing things that you may or may not want. So make sure to, at the very least, use visualization tools to figure out what your baseline is and look for anomalies. But it's much better to get tools that will automate this for you, like our ThreatSync Plus products.
Yeah,
So with that,
automation is definitely the future of cybersecurity. I'm looking forward to automating myself out of a job at some point.
yes, I mean, automate yourself into a job. The fact that you are automating is one of your greatest values to me, Mark. It does look like we've gotten a few questions. I'll jump through them real quickly and give some to you, Mark. One of the questions to both of us is, can fireboxes integrate with cloud security solutions like AWS, Azure, or Google Cloud?
Yeah.
The answer is yes, but it depends on what and in different limited functions. First of all, do you know we have cloud versions both in AWS and Azure of our Firebox? So you can spin a Firebox directly into the cloud if you want to. And then the integration can be VPN. You might have both on-premise, virtual, and cloud firewalls, and you might want to securely connect those infrastructures to each other and have more control of what passes between them. VPN's an option. But besides that, I highly recommend you check out on the WatchGuard page our technology partner integrations, because there's other interesting integrations. Some are better than others, in my opinion, but one big one is, I mentioned we have a SMTP proxy, an email proxy, where if your server is on-prem, we offer tons and tons of email security to it. When you move to Office 365, which is not a public cloud, it's more a SaaS-like service, so a SaaS-like cloud. There's no firebox there, so that makes it a challenge to actually secure that traffic. But there are tricky integrations where you can actually redirect traffic through your firebox first to M365 to regain some of those protections. But to be honest, for that level of integration, I highly recommend our email protection solution, which is cloud-based. But VPN and network connections are the most primary connection to fireboxes in the cloud. And don't forget that you can absolutely just put a firebox in those public clouds. This one I'm going to pass to you, Mark, because I think it's possible through policy, but I don't think it's the default. One of our listeners asked, if you're using a VPN, in this case, they're probably talking about a mobile user VPN, not a branch-to-branch VPN. Does the traffic pass through all these WatchGuard security services we talked about in the report? By default, by the way, I don't think it does. But is there any way, Mark, to get your mobile users to go through Firebox services?
So it's going to depend on the VPN, and you'll have better luck with things like SSL VPNs. So these days, most mobile user VPNs use different technologies like WireGuard that aren't like web traffic compliant, which means we can't man in the middle it, decrypt it to inspect it. If it's an older like SSL or TLS based VPN, as long as it's not doing client authentication, like client certificate authentication, which typically they are, but if it's not, then we can inspect it. This is really the power of mobile user VPNs, though. That's why you want one, in order to prevent other people from inspecting it. And so this is where controlling the applications that are used within your organization comes into play, and knowing what your users have installed on their computer and if it could potentially circumvent some of your security controls. I will say a quick plug for some of our services, especially one that just released. So FireCloud Internet Access is a great way to provide secure internet access for your mobile users, where no matter where they are, it goes through the same services, or at least a subset of the services on the Firebox hosted in the cloud. And the next iteration of that, Secure Private Access, will allow, similar to a user VPN, access onto a local
ZTNA,
network.
Zero Trust.
Exactly.
So yeah, that's a great example, Mark, in that VPN is great today, but FireCloud Internet Access plus private access combined will be disruptive and will be what we recommend to replace VPN, because one, it gives you a firebox wherever you are. Even if you're not behind a hardware or virtual one, like Mark said, you get the protection. But it still is going to be using the same technology to encrypt its traffic back to your hardware when you get the private access version. And then you have the best of both worlds. So highly recommend that. As Mark mentioned, internet access now and private, whatever it's called, coming soon. Another question is, do we have any, we talked a lot about security awareness training. Are there any tools or software to make it more company based? And that absolutely yes. It's something WatchGuard has not got into directly yet. We've worked with businesses that do it, but we do not sell these security awareness training platforms. But there are many out there. I will be very candid. There's a lot of, I don't always share things like security controls for security reason, but we use KnowBe4 for our security awareness training. They're a well-known and popular one, largely because Kevin Mitnick is associated with them. But there's
Was
tons of.
associated with them.
Oh yeah, yeah. I didn't realize he left.
Oh,
There's other great ones like Ninjio, which I think their animated ones are pretty cool. Awareness training, Defendify, and many, many others. All of them are attached to LMNs, I believe it's called, Learning Management Networks. So they allow you to just schedule this through Outlook. They integrate with AD. You just pick what training to mandate, and it organizes schedules, automates the email. There's lots of them that do it for you. So I really highly recommend those security awareness platforms, although most come at a cost. To be kind, I will share the only one I've heard of that's free that some NGOs use. If you go to security-companion.net, this is a free security awareness training platform that I think is completely open source, and I think some NGOs use it. I love open source, but the problem with it, you need the platform to automate, and the platform might have a little differentiation, but to be honest, it's the content, the regularly reoccurring, updated, translated. If you're a global company, it's very important it's translated content. That's the most important part. And I'm really not sure how good a free tool like securitycompanion.net keeps up with those.
the only thing I would add is get yourself a Camtasia Essentials license and make your own content. Go find pre-canned hacking demos that can show the latest trends. You can probably find plenty of content as inspiration off YouTube, and then tailor it towards your specific organization. Record a quick video, hide your face if you don't like being in front of camera, but at least do a voiceover explaining what the thing you are trying to demo, how it could impact your organization if it succeeded. It's a great way to get engagement from your users, is seeing an actual hack real time, and demos are a great way of doing that. And all the platforms Corey just mentioned support custom content. If you upload a video, you can upload it in there and assign it out pretty easily.
An update, by the way, as I just learned that the person that asked the question about can you get security services over VPN, they weren't actually talking about our mobile VPN, but they were talking about private VPN services like NordVPN or private internet access or many others. For the audience, I'm sure you know what these are, but these aren't like uh, office or company VPNs back to headquarters. These are adding your own encryption and privacy to your desktop's traffic. So at work behind a firebox, I could launch something like NordVPN, happens to be one I use, and that will make a private VPN connection to one of Nord's IPs, and then all the traffic I send, any devices between me and them, they're going to see the encrypted traffic, but because it's encrypted, they may not be able to see anything useful. So technically, those don't they do basically evade our security services. They don't, in that the HTTPS traffic or whatever mechanism they use for encryption will still go through our firebox, but because it's encrypted, there's very little our security services can do. So yes, private VPN will sneak through some security services, but there's a big but. One of the controls you can add to fireboxes is you can do this both with web blocker, with DNS watch from a domain level, or you can do this from application control from a network level. In all of those different things that block domains or sites or things like that by, for instance, their genre of site, and then application control looks for signs in traffic, all of them actually have setups for VPN and encrypted traffic. So if you want to prevent your users from doing NordVPN outside your firebox, you can do a combination of adding application control. There'll be I forget what the category is, but there'll be a category to block private VPNs, Or you can use things like, I believe, both WebLocker and DNS Watch, right, Mark, where for the product to, the categories of websites and domains, they will know the Nords and the all the VP, all the different domains and IPs associated with those. So while technically, if you allow these tools from inside your network, the security services won't be as effective, you can prevent your users from using them.
Perfect. I think thank you everyone for sticking around 10 minutes past time. If you do have any other questions, you can always reach out to us. I'm sure you can find our emails, but quick plug for our podcast that Corey mentioned earlier, every week talking about the latest security news and mostly just me making fun of him. Definitely recommend checking that out. Any final thoughts, Corey?
Nope. I'd like to say I make fun of you too.
Thank you everyone for
Mr.
hanging out with us today.
Enunciate the acronyms perfectly every time guy.
Perfectly every time.
Cheers. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.